The desert had a way of keeping its own secrets. Some evenings felt so still that even the wind seemed unsure if it should breathe. And then there were nights, quiet, ordinary nights, when life arrived without warning, asking to be let in. That was the kind of night when everything shifted for Elias. It began with a sound so soft, he almost convinced himself he imagined it. Just a faint scrape against wood, the kind that makes you lean forward and hold your breath. At first, it felt like nothing, but later, he would look back on that moment as the instant an entire story began to unfold. A moment that opened more than just a front door. The clock on the wall hummed in its steady way, keeping time in a house where time had lost most of its urgency. Elias stood at the kitchen counter with 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one for Margaret's framed photo beside the vase of dried desert lavender. He'd placed her cup there every morning for 6 years now. Not out of habit, but out of the kind of loyalty grief sometimes becomes. Quiet, unspoken, and unwavering. Copper, his old ginger tabby, sat curled at the foot of the table. The soft warmth of the coffee drifted across the room. The silence felt familiar, almost like an old friend who knew exactly where to sit so as not to take up too much space. But beneath that stillness lived something else. What Elias privately thought of as the empty room inside him. A room shaped like the life he'd once had, filled with the quiet ache of being the only one left to remember it. It was this room that the desert seemed to notice that evening. The knock came again. Not a human knock, not the wind. Something in between, a scraping, deliberate, fragile sound. Elias set down the coffee cup, hands tightening on the counter, listening. Copper lifted his head, ears turning sharply toward the door. The cat made a soft, uncertain sound, half curiosity, half unease. Elias took a breath, the kind he often took before stepping into memories he wasn't sure he was ready for. Then he walked to the door. He opened it only a few inches at first, just enough to let the porch light spill across the packed earth outside. The desert stretched quietly and pale beneath a thin winter moon. And then he saw her, a wild bobcat, thin, trembling, and unmistakably pregnant, lay sprawled against the wooden threshold. Her breathing was shallow. Her fur was streaked with dust, and in her golden eyes there was a weary plea that didn't belong to a creature known for its secrecy and pride. This was not how bobcats behaved, not in winter, not. The moment stretched into something larger than itself, an unexpected bridge between 2 beings who had no earthly reason to cross paths. For years he had thought of his home as a place the world had passed by. A quiet cabin outside Winslow, Arizona, half wrapped in juniper shade and red earth. A place where days were measured not by plans, but by the slow rhythm of a man trying to keep his heart from closing any further than it already had. Yet here, Copper padded up beside Elias, tail low, gaze fixed on the bobcat. There was no hiss, no bristled fear, just a strange stillness, as though he recognized something familiar in her exhaustion, a memory of the winter he had limped onto this porch as a stray, ribs showing, eyes too tired for the fight. Elias knelt carefully, keeping his voice level. "Easy now," he murmured, though he wasn't sure which of them needed the reassurance more. Her sides rose and fell unevenly, not just from injury, but from the weight she carried, the life she carried. She didn't flinch when he reached out, and that alone felt like a small miracle. He understood wild animals, spent decades working in parks, learning how fear shaped their choices. A pregnant bobcat approaching a human home was not boldness, it was desperation. And behind desperation, there was always a story. He eased the door open wider. The warm air came spilling out, stirring her fur. For a moment, she simply looked at him. A long, steady look that felt like a question waiting for an answer. Inside him, something tightened. He remembered Margaret standing in this very doorway, years ago, handing out blankets to hikers caught in sudden storms. Opening the door had been her way of living, a small act of kindness repeated so often it left an imprint on the house itself. Maybe that's why the next movement felt so natural. He stepped aside. The bobcat gathered what little strength she had left and dragged herself over the threshold. Copper followed behind her, not as a guard, but almost like a guide. They crossed the entryway, one limping, one steady, and then both settled near the fireplace where the last embers still glowed faintly. Elias closed the door. The soft click echoed through the cabin. A door closing, a door opening, both at once. He moved slowly, careful not to alarm her. Kneeling again, he saw the dried blood along her flank. The wound wasn't fresh, but it was deep, and the cold outside had drained what little energy she had left. He worked quietly, warming a cloth near the fire, cleaning around the injury. Copper sat close, his eyes locked on the bobcat, as if guarding her while Elias worked. The way he positioned himself, shoulders lifted, tail wrapped neatly around his paws, carried a kind of unexpected calm. A house cat behaving as though he understood this moment required softness. The bobcat didn't resist. Her breathing steadied slightly under the warmth of the fire, under the quiet presence of two creatures who meant her no harm. For the first time in a long while, the silence in the room felt different. Not empty, not heavy, just present, shared. Elias glanced again at Margaret's photo on the table, the cup of coffee still steaming beside it. He imagined what she would have said if she'd been here. Probably something simple, something true. "She trusted the door," she might have whispered. "You only had to open it." He sat back, hands trembling just a little, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness that his life had just shifted. The cabin felt a little less lonely. The air is a little warmer. The world is a little closer. Sable, the name wouldn't come until later, closed her eyes. Copper curled himself into a soft orange shape beside her. Two creatures at opposite ends of the animal kingdom, sharing warmth without questioning it. Elias watched them, feeling something stir in the quiet places inside him. A softened edge, a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. It's strange how life arrives, not always with noise or urgency. Sometimes it comes to your doorstep, injured and frightened, asking only for a chance. And sometimes, without meaning to, you open a door you thought you'd closed forever. Stay with me, because what happened after this night, especially what Copper did next, is something I still think about when the evenings grow quiet. By morning, the bobcat would reveal more than her wound. She would show why she had chosen this porch, this house, this man, and how trust can take root even in the most unexpected corners of the wild. Sometimes the wild carries its own messages, quiet but urgent, carried in the way an animal hesitates before choosing where to fall. And on that winter night, as Elias watched the exhausted bobcat settle near his fireplace, he sensed there was a deeper story behind her arrival, something instinctive, ancient, and entirely unplanned. Most bobcats avoid human scent from more than 100 yards away, yet this one, trembling, heavy with unborn life, had crossed that distance, approached a cabin, and scratched gently at a door. It was a choice that defied everything her species had learned over centuries. But desperation has its own rules. Elias sat on the floor a few feet away, giving her the space she needed. The firelight brushed across the room, revealing how thin she was beneath her winter coat. Her flanks rose and fell unevenly. Copper lay near her, not touching, but near enough to offer warmth. That too was unusual. Copper had never enjoyed sharing his space with any other animal, yet here he was, silent and steady beside a creature whose wild instincts should have kept them worlds apart. What made her come? Elias had spent most of his adult life working in open country, tending trails, tracking seasonal migration patterns, and teaching visitors the quiet respect owed to animals who live without fences. He understood that wild mothers behave differently in the late stages of pregnancy. Hue sharpens, territory expands, risk tolerance shifts. A bobcat looking for a birthing den follows more than instinct. She follows need. He studied the way she rested her head on her paws, eyes half closed but still aware. Every so often, her ears twitched toward distant sounds outside. That vigilance, even in exhaustion, told him a great deal. She wasn't just injured. She was protecting lives she had not yet brought into the world. Bobcats prefer rock crevices, thickets, or hollow logs for birthing. Places where shadows stay in place and predators can't easily slip through narrow gaps. Yet storms, injury, or other males encroaching on their territory can force a mother to seek shelter wherever the land will allow.
The cabin, to her, might have looked like a last chance. A warm shape against a cold landscape. A place where wind couldn't reach her bones.
Elias watched as she shifted slightly, and a soft, painful sound escaped her throat. It wasn't loud, just a crack in her strength.
Copper responded first, moving a little closer. His head lowered, his breath warm against the air between them. For a moment, their eyes met. One domesticated by years of human comfort, the other shaped by survival and solitude.
Elias couldn't help thinking back to the day he first saw Copper as a half-starved stray huddled against his porch. It had been a sharp February morning with a sky the color of cold steel. The cat had dragged himself forward with the same kind of quiet plea he now saw in the bobcat's face. And the way Copper gazed at her now, it was as if he remembered that moment and recognized the look of an animal asking for help without knowing how to ask.
"She must have walked a long way,"
Elias whispered, more to fill the stillness than to be heard. "Long enough to know she couldn't keep going." The bobcat's sides trembled again, and he noticed something else. Her belly dropped low, heavier than before. The signs were clear. She wasn't just pregnant. She was nearing the end of her journey. Under different circumstances, she might have found a thicket or a hollowed juniper root, but tonight, she had chosen his porch. A soft thought entered his mind, uninvited but strangely comforting. Margaret would have opened the door too. He could almost hear her voice, gentle, certain, grounded in her belief that kindness didn't need to be complicated. She used to say that every creature has a reason for the direction it walks. Sometimes the direction leads to us, and the only choice we have is whether to meet it with fear or with a steady hand. The bobcat lifted her head, eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the heat rising from the hearth. Elias knew enough biology to understand what warmth means in the animal world. Heat leads to safety. Safety leads to lowered stress, and a mother under stress releases hormones that can threaten the survival of her young. It explained why she had come, despite every instinct telling her not to. He shifted just a bit, not wanting to startle her. She watched him, her gaze unblinking but softer now. There was no growl, no warning. Instead, she did something small but unmistakable. She allowed her shoulders to relax. "All right," Elias murmured, leaning back. "You're safe here for now." Outside, the desert wind brushed against the shuttered windows, carrying with it the smell of cold earth and distant sagebrush. Inside, the bobcat's breath slowed into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. Copper rested one paw near her side, not touching but offering presence. Elias found himself mirroring the stillness, settling into the quiet as though the room itself were reminding him how to breathe. He thought back to countless evenings in ranger stations, studying wildlife behavior charts, notes on bobcat movement patterns, observations about their territorial shifts during winter. Facts he used to know as easily as his own name, and yet none of those pages had ever mentioned what it feels like to sit in a warm room with a wild mother who has chosen, not by logic, but by instinct, to trust you. That part isn't written in textbooks. This moment carried a different weight. It felt like standing at the edge of something fragile, something that asked for patience rather than explanation. As Elias watched her rest, a new awareness grew in him. He had lived so long in a house where silence echoed. Now, that silence held new meaning. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was a space being filled, slowly, carefully, by the presence of a being fighting to keep her young alive. An odd thought flickered through him. Maybe she didn't just choose the cabin. Maybe she chose the person inside it. It was a thought he didn't speak aloud, but it stayed with him, warm and strange, and quietly grounding. He reached for the blanket draped over the arm of the sofa,
a worn cotton piece Margaret had kept by the door in case desert nights turned colder than expected. He placed it gently near the bobcat, letting the warmth reach her without forcing it. She shifted slightly, her eyes softening, and for the first time since she collapsed on the porch, she exhaled fully, a long, slow release of tension.
Elias sat back, his hands resting loosely on his knees. Copper curled himself by the bobcat's front paws, purring so faintly it sounded like a hum beneath the crackle of the fire. The room felt different now. Not louder, not busier, just fuller, as if the wild and the domestic had found a rare moment of agreement. Sometimes the creatures who fear us most are the ones who see us most clearly. They notice the quiet inside us, the loneliness we carry without meaning to. And when they come to our door, they remind us of something simple. Connection doesn't always arrive in familiar shapes. In the natural world, survival is often painted as fierce and solitary. But every mother, whether wild or tame, understands something deeper. When the world grows harsh and hope grows thin, instinct doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for the safest path, even if that path leads to a human threshold. Stay with this story, because by the time dawn arrived and the fire settled into a soft glow, something happened that showed just how far trust can reach. In the next chapter, we'll step into the fragile early hours inside that cabin, where three beings, each carrying their own story of survival, began learning how to share the same space. The quiet bond that grew there would become the heart of everything that followed. There are moments when a house shifts, not in its foundation but in the air, in the way footsteps sound against the floor, in the way silence wraps itself around those inside. That first night with the bobcat resting near the fire was one of those moments. Nothing dramatic happened, nothing loud. And yet, something in the cabin felt different, as if three separate lives had quietly agreed to keep breathing in the same small circle of warmth. Trust rarely arrives all at once. It comes in small, nearly invisible pieces, like the first time a wild animal closes its eyes in your presence, or the moment a timid house cat stops watching from the doorway and steps just a little closer. Those tiny movements can change everything, even when no words are spoken. Hours after Elias helped the bobcat settle near the hearth, the storm outside eased into a light desert wind. The room glowed with the soft orange of embers, painting warm halos across the floorboards. Copper had curled himself into a sleepy crescent beside the visitor, his tail tucked neatly around his paws. Elias sat nearby, leaning against the wooden frame of his favorite chair, watching them through steady breaths. The three of them created a quiet triangle, wild, domestic, human, connected by the simple need to feel safe for one more night. He could feel the weight of it. Not a heavy weight, but a meaningful one. The bobcat, whom he hadn't yet named, rested with the careful stillness of a creature conserving every ounce of strength. Her breathing steadied as the hours passed. Now and then her ears twitched, catching sounds only she could interpret. The ticking of the clock, Copper's slow purr, the subtle settling of the house as the outside cold pressed against its walls. Elias lifted himself slowly from the floor, careful not to disturb her. He placed another log into the firebox, keeping the warmth steady. "There you go," he whispered, as though warmth itself was something that needed to be said gently. He paused, surprised at how natural the moment felt. The whole scene reminded him of something he didn't expect. The nights Margaret used to sit near the fire after long days working in the community clinic, her shoulders sagging but her face relaxed in the glow. The memory wasn't sharp. It didn't sting the way it once had. It arrived softly, like a familiar hand resting against his. The bobcat blinked slowly, watching him. Most people never see a bobcat up close, unless one darts across a trail. They live like moving shadows, patient, solitary, designed to pass through the world without leaving much behind. Seeing one like this, in the open, vulnerable enough to stay still in a person's presence, that alone told a story. Elias knew enough about wildlife behavior to understand what it meant. When a wild mother allows herself to rest in front of someone, it is not trust in the way humans think of trust. It is instinct to make a careful decision.
This place is safer than the cold night outside. Still, he felt something shift inside him. Her presence brought a sense of purpose back into the house, a sense that his hands could still be useful, his steadiness still needed. He sat again, this time a bit closer. Not close enough to create pressure, but enough to show he wasn't afraid of sharing space. Copper opened one eye, glanced at him, then at the bobcat, as if to say he was monitoring the situation with great seriousness. It was Copper who surprised Elias most. When Copper first arrived years ago, he'd been all bones and dust, limping with an injury that looked older than his fear of people. It had taken weeks before the cat allowed himself to sleep anywhere near Elias's feet. The two of them had built a quiet companionship over time, born of unspoken understanding rather than affection. And yet now, Copper acted like a small guardian, steady, patient, positioning himself between the bobcat and the cool draft that slipped under the front door. He didn't seem to question why she was there. He didn't seem jealous or threatened. He simply accepted that she needed warmth, too. It was a reminder, Elias thought, of how animals can see things we miss, like shared suffering, shared fragility, or the simple truth that gentleness is sometimes the safest instinct of all. Through the long, slow hours of the early morning, Elias watched how the wild mother responded to the cabin's small sounds. When he rose to fetch a blanket from the hallway, she lifted her head but didn't tense. When Copper shifted positions, she glanced at him, then let her eyelids lower again. The peace in the room wasn't absolute, but it was growing in thin, steady layers. He laid the blanket a foot away from her, letting her choose if she wanted the extra warmth. She watched him do it, eyes calm. That simple look, open, steady, felt like the first small thread of trust forming between them. As the sky outside faded from deep blue to a faint pale gray, Elias found himself listening to more than just the room. He listened inwardly to the quiet ache that had lived in him since Margaret passed. Most days, that ache felt like a locked door, a sealed-off corner of life he didn't know how to revisit. But tonight, the ache softened, just a little. Maybe it was the fire. Maybe it was the presence of another heartbeat in the house. Or maybe, he didn't want to admit it too quickly, maybe it was the reminder that even when life changes shape in ways we never asked for, there are moments when connection still finds a way to slip through the cracks. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to let the moment settle. When he opened them again, Copper had shifted closer to the bobcat, resting his head gently near her shoulder. The sight brought a warmth to Elias's throat. It was such a simple action, but it carried the kind of tenderness that echoes long after the moment passes. It struck him that healing doesn't always appear in grand, sweeping gestures. Sometimes it looks like a weary animal, allowing herself to rest, or a house cat pressing close to someone who needs comfort. Sometimes healing is nothing more than 3 quiet lives deciding to share the same patch of floor until the morning light arrives. The wild and the domestic are often spoken of as if they belong in opposite worlds, one ruled by instinct, the other by familiarity. But in truth, they share something universal: the need for safety, the longing for warmth, the instinct to seek kindness when darkness grows too heavy. Under one roof, those worlds didn't feel separate at all. They felt connected by threads too gentle to explain, but too real to ignore. Stay with this story a little longer. What began as a single act of shelter soon became something none of them expected. Something that would challenge instincts, deepen bonds, and melt even the most guarded hearts. Because by the next evening, Elias realized the cabin wasn't enough. The bobcat needed a place soft enough for new life, hidden enough for her instincts, and warm enough to carry her through the hardest part of her journey. And so he turned to a place he hadn't stepped into since the day Margaret left it behind. There are places we avoid, not because they're dangerous, but because they hold too many memories. Sometimes those memories sit quietly in corners, gathering dust beside tools no one has touched in years. And sometimes, unexpectedly, a moment arrives that asks us to open the door again. By the second morning, it was clear the bobcat needed more than warmth. She needed a protected space, a sanctuary. And for Elias,
That realization led him to the one door on his property he hadn't opened since the day everything changed.
The sun climbed slowly over the Arizona horizon, laying pale gold across the yard. The bobcat slept deeply near the hearth, her breathing steadier, her body finally relaxing under Copper's gentle watch.
Elias stepped outside to check the air, pulling his jacket tighter as a cool wind carried the scent of juniper and desert clay. He looked toward the old shed.
Margaret's shed. It stood behind the house, softened by weather and time. Long ago, she had used it for storing gardening tools, clay pots, and seeds she saved in small envelopes. When she passed, Elias could never bring himself to open the door. The shed became a still image, unchanged, untouched, quietly waiting. But now, a living creature inside his home was asking for something he couldn't ignore.
He walked toward the shed with slow, uncertain steps, Copper following at his heels. The key was still hooked to a rusted nail by the doorframe.
His fingers hesitated for a moment before turning it. The lock clicked, and the door eased open on a breath of air scented with old soil and cedar wood. Dust hung in narrow beams of morning light. Tools leaned against the walls exactly as she had left them. A half-finished potting bench sat under the window, flecked with dried paint. On a shelf near the back, a small watering can rested beside a pair of worn gloves.
Elias stood in the doorway, not entering, only remembering. It felt like standing in a room where time had paused the moment she walked away from it. He drew a breath.
The bobcat needed somewhere dark, quiet, enclosed. And this was the only space sheltered enough to give her what instinct demanded.
His voice came out barely above a whisper.
"All right,"
he said, stepping inside.
"Let's make this right."
He began by clearing the floor, moving aside tools with care rather than haste, as though Margaret might still need them someday. Each object carried its own small weight: a pair of pruning shears she used in spring, the clay pots she stacked neatly by size, the old wooden crate where she kept twine and cloth ties. Elias ran a hand along the potting bench.
He could almost hear her humming as she worked here on warm afternoons. That memory stirred something tender inside him.
The ache was still there, but it felt less sharp now, softened by the presence of the wild mother sleeping inside his home.
"Margaret would have approved of this," he said quietly, "helping another mother."
He stepped back and took in the shed with clearer eyes.
He saw what it could become, a protected nest, a place where new life could arrive safely.
He gathered old blankets from the house, shaking out the dust.
He found a wooden board sturdy enough to form a raised platform. He worked slowly, testing each nail before hammering, mindful not to create unnecessary noise. Copper supervised the whole operation, weaving around his legs, watching every movement as if offering his own kind of encouragement. As the work progressed, the space changed. What had once been a room, frozen in memory, began transforming into something present, something needed.
Elias lined the platform with soft blankets and set a second layer of worn towels along the back wall.
He added a small crate turned on its side, creating a den-like corner the bobcat could slip into when labor began. He had read enough wildlife manuals over the years to know that mothers choose darkness and close walls to hide their vulnerability. He paused again, stepping back to look at his handiwork. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe. It was warm. It was enough. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the wood siding, as though encouraging the moment forward. He walked back to the cabin. Copper trotted ahead of him, tail high. When they stepped inside, the bobcat lifted her head slightly, eyes tracking them both. She looked stronger today, as if rest had settled deep into her bones. Elias crouched beside her. "Come on, girl. I've made something for you." He didn't try to coax her with touch. He didn't rush. He simply stepped back and held the door open, letting instinct guide her choice. The moment stretched. Quiet, steady, patient. Then, slowly, she rose. Limping but determined, she followed the path he had cleared across the yard. Copper walked beside her, matching her pace. The image was almost unreal. A wild bobcat and a gentle housecat moving side by side under the pale winter sun. When they reached the shed, she paused at the entrance, lifting her head to scent the air inside. Something in her relaxed. She stepped forward and entered, curls of dust rising under her paws. Elias watched as she circled the platform, turned once, and settled into the soft blankets.
She let out a breath so long and deep, it seemed to empty weeks of strain.
Copper lay near the doorway, not intruding, simply keeping vigil.
In that moment, Elias felt something shift in his chest, a small crack opening in the walls he'd built around grief. Preparing this space had felt like touching a part of Margaret again, but without the sharp sting. Instead, it felt like he was continuing something she started, her quiet kindness, her unspoken understanding that caring for the small and fragile was never a burden.
Sometimes creating a haven for another creature becomes a way of creating a safe space inside oneself. The shed was no longer a room frozen in time.
It had become a bridge between past and present, between pain and comfort, between a solitary man and the wild mother who trusted him enough to rest. We often think of shelter as walls and a roof, but true shelter is something deeper. It's the intention behind a gesture, the quiet promise of safety, the offering of warmth without condition. For the bobcat, the shed meant survival. For Elias, it meant connection, a reminder that kindness could still move through him, even after loss. Stay with this journey, because what unfolded next tested instincts, deepened unexpected loyalty, and revealed a lesson in love that even the quiet desert couldn't hold back. As night fell once more, the wind rising in soft waves across the yard, the first signs came that her time was near. And in the dim light of the shed, with Copper standing guard, Elias discovered just how much courage it takes for all species to bring new life into the world. Some nights hold their breath before anything happens. The air changes first. A certain tension, a hush settles over the earth, followed by the quiet certainty that something is drawing near. That was how the night began for Elias, long before he realized he was about to witness one of the most tender, life-filled moments the desert had ever offered him. It started with a single sound in the shed. Not a cry, not a growl, just a low, uneven breath that made Elias's heart tighten, because he knew instinct often speaks louder than words. And tonight, instinct was calling him. Late winter winds swept across the yard, brushing the grasses flat as they passed. Inside the shed, Sable shifted, her muscles coiling and releasing with restless urgency. She had chosen the darkest corner of the platform Elias built for her, turning in circles the way wild mothers do when they're preparing for something they cannot delay. Elias stood at the doorway, lantern held low. He didn't step inside right away. He waited, letting her feel his presence before he offered his help. She lifted her head, eyes luminous in the dim light, and for a long moment, their quiet breaths filled the space between them. She wasn't afraid, not of him, not of Copper, who hovered at her side like a small, devoted sentinel. She was in pain, yes, but beneath that pain lived trust, a fragile, unspoken trust that she had allowed to grow over the past days. Elias recognized it in the way she watched him, not as a threat, but as something solid she could lean into if the night demanded it. He knelt slowly, setting the lantern near the wall to soften the shadows. "All right, girl," he murmured, voice steady. "We're right here." Copper edged closer, his nose brushing the straw beside her. It was remarkable to see, a domestic cat offering silent encouragement to a wild mother. Their closeness would have startled any wildlife expert. Yet in this small shed, under soft light and the weight of a winter night, it felt natural, as if their two worlds had never really been separate. A deep tremor moved through Sable's body. Her breath hitched. She let out a low, guttural sound that instinctively made Copper take a single step back, only to return, positioning himself where she could see he hadn't abandoned her. Elias recognized the rhythm. He'd seen animals give birth before, elk in the high meadows, pronghorn near the chalky ridges, but never a bobcat this close. Never under his roof. Never in a space filled with memories of someone he once shared everything with. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. The first kitten arrived with surprising ease, a small, slick shape of life glistening in the lantern glow. Sable instinctively curled around her newborn, cleaning it with careful rhythmic licks. Elias let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Then the second came, smaller but strong. She tended to it immediately, nudging it toward her belly. Elias felt his eyes sting, not with sadness, but with something gentler, something close to gratitude. To witness new life arrive in a place that had been so empty. It stirred something deep in him. But the third took longer. Much longer. Sable strained and cried, her muscles tightening in waves that left her trembling. Her claws scraped the wood. Her breathing turned ragged. The air grew heavy with worry. Copper lowered himself beside her, placing one paw near her front leg, as if to anchor her to the ground. His purr was soft but constant, a steady hum that seemed to hold the room together. Elias leaned forward, heart pounding. He saw the problem. The kitten was positioned poorly, one tiny paw bent backward, blocking the way. Without help, both mother and baby were in danger. "Easy," he whispered, though his own hands shook. "Let's get you through this." He'd delivered animals before, but this felt different, more delicate, more uncertain, more meaningful. Sable's eyes met his, wild, pained but not frightened.
She held his gaze in a way that made everything else small. The wind outside, the memories tugging at him, even the ache of missing Margaret.
It was as if Sable was silently permitting him to reach across the fragile line between wild and human.
He steadied his breath, eased his hands toward the struggling kitten, and gently repositioned the paw. The tiny body slipped free into his palms, limp and far too still. The world narrowed. For a moment, Elias heard nothing, not the wind, not the fire crackling in the cabin, not even his own heartbeat. Then Copper moved, the cat pressed in close, licking the kitten with urgent, determined strokes. Elias recognized the motion. Not random, not confused, but purposeful. Domestic cats sometimes revived newborns in their litters, and Copper, guided by instinct and memory, was doing what he could to help. A faint sound, thin as a whisper, escaped the kitten. Elias exhaled sharply, relief flooding his chest. Sable reached forward, drawing the newborn gently toward her, warming it with her body until its small cries strengthened.
Minutes later, a fourth kitten arrived, healthy and vigorous.
The shed felt warmer suddenly, filled with the tiny squeaks of 4 new lives. Elias sat back, letting his shoulders settle. His hands trembled with the aftermath of adrenaline and wonder. Copper brushed against his arm briefly before returning to sit beside Sable, his purr vibrating through the straw. The lantern glowed softly on the scene before him. Sable curled protectively around her litter, Copper nestled close. A strange but beautiful family born from need, instinct, and unexpected kindness. Watching them, Elias felt something shift inside him. He'd spent so long believing his life had narrowed that grief had carved out a quiet emptiness where nothing new could grow. But here, in this small shed filled with warmth and breathing and fragile beginnings, he realized that emptiness could hold new things too. Things so gentle they arrived only when he wasn't looking. Life doesn't always return in the ways we expect. Sometimes it shows up wounded and frightened on our doorstep. Sometimes it comes in the form of a newborn fighting for its first breath. And sometimes it arrives through unlikely partnerships. A wild mother, a house cat, and a man learning that healing often enters through the smallest cracks. Stay with this story, because what unfolded in the days ahead revealed bonds deeper than instinct, and taught Elias, Copper, and Sable that family can take shapes no one imagines. As dawn crept over the desert, painting the sky in muted rose and gold, Elias realized the challenge wasn't over. The kittens needed more than shelter. They needed guidance from both worlds. And in the days that followed, wild lessons and domestic comfort intertwined in ways no one could have predicted. Some mornings arrive quietly, carrying a softness that settles before the day begins. The air holds its breath for a moment, as if waiting to see what will unfold. For Elias, the first morning after the kitten's birth was exactly that kind of morning. Still, tender, and filled with the beginnings of something no one could have predicted. New life often changes a home before anyone realizes it. It shifts the rhythm, slows the silence, and fills each corner with a different kind of warmth. And inside that shed, where wild instincts and gentle domestic habits lived side by side, the days ahead would reveal just how deeply two worlds can teach one another. When Elias stepped into the shed at dawn, he moved carefully, as if entering a sacred space. Sable lay curled around her 4 kittens, their tiny bodies pressed close to her belly. 4 heartbeats, small and determined, shifting beneath her fur. Copper sat a few inches away, alert but calm, keeping the kind of watchfulness that didn't come from obligation. It came from understanding. The newborns weren't even opening their eyes yet. Their paws kneaded instinctively, searching, exploring, learning the shape of their mother. And Sable, though exhausted, carried the weary pride of a mother who had done something brave. Elias lowered himself onto an overturned crate against the far wall. He didn't speak. There were no words that fit. Instead, he let the quiet settle between them. It was the kind of quiet that didn't ache, not today. It simply felt full. As hours turned to days, he witnessed something remarkable. Both Sable and Copper began teaching the kittens, each in their own way. Their lessons matched their worlds, one shaped by the untamed wild, the other by the rhythms of a peaceful home. Sable's lessons always came first, guided by instinct honed through generations. She showed her kittens how to use the shadows. Even in the confined space of the shed, she created practice opportunities, crouching behind blankets, freezing mid-step, letting the kittens discover her with their tiny noses twitching. Elias watched from the doorway as she demonstrated the silent step, the careful placement of paws, the way her whiskers moved as she scented the air. Each movement was a thread connecting her to the world she came from, the world her young would have to face soon enough. Her instincts were sharp, precise, and protective. Then there was Copper. His lessons came unexpectedly, arriving in soft, almost comical moments. While Sable taught stealth, Copper taught curiosity. He introduced the kittens to play, tapping a loose string with exaggerated seriousness, rolling onto his back to show them what harmless wrestling looked like, nudging small pieces of straw toward them as if presenting important treasures. One morning, Elias came in and found Copper standing inside a shallow tray of sand, digging neatly with his back paws. The kittens watched with fascination. Then one of them toddled over, clumsily imitating him. It made no sense in terms of wild survival, but it made perfect sense in terms of learning from the nearest example of gentle behavior. Elias couldn't help smiling. "You're doing a fine job, Copper." The cat glanced back at him with an expression that seemed to say he was simply fulfilling an important duty. But Sable didn't push him away. She allowed him into the small, sacred circle of her family. That acceptance alone was astonishing. A few days later, Elias invited someone who could help him understand what he was seeing. Emma, a wildlife biologist from a nearby university, arrived holding a folder and wearing a cautious smile. She had heard about the unusual situation from a mutual acquaintance and was eager to study it. Not to interfere, but to observe and guide. She stood at the shed entrance for a long moment, watching the bobcat family. "This is extraordinary," she whispered. "Cross-species cooperation like this, it isn't unheard of, but it's incredibly rare." Elias nodded. "Copper's taken to them like they're his own." Emma smiled softly. "It makes sense. Domestic cats can be deeply empathetic, but for Sable to allow it, especially while nursing, that's the part that amazes me. She trusts both of you." Elias didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The truth settled quietly in his chest. Trust wasn't something he took lightly. After losing Margaret, he'd pulled into himself, turning the world into something he kept at arm's length. But now, without asking his permission, life had begun to fill the hollow spaces again. A wild mother, a house cat, and 4 tiny creatures who didn't yet know the difference between danger and comfort. As days passed, the kittens grew stronger. Their eyes opened, small blue orbs reflecting the world in blurred shapes. They began wobbling across the shed on unsteady legs, tumbling into Copper, who tolerated every clumsy jump with the patience of a saint. Sable watched everything. If a kitten strayed too far, she nudged it back. If one cried, she responded instantly. Her loyalty to them, her fierce love, reminded Elias of something he had once known, something he missed. Margaret's hands had always been gentle, even when life was difficult. She used to tend her garden with motions that echoed the same reverence Sable showed her young. And watching Sable now reminded Elias of those mornings when Margaret paused to admire a single bloom, whispering that life was beautiful, even when fragile.
He felt her presence often now, not as sorrow, but as a soft memory guiding him forward. His grief didn't disappear. It simply changed shape. In helping Sable raise her young, Elias found a quiet healing of his own. The shed, once a room filled with memories he couldn't face, had become a place where the past and present met gently. The wild kittens didn't just bring new life, they brought something back to Elias that he thought he'd lost forever. Purpose. People often say wildness and home belong on opposite sides of a fence. But in truth, the line between them can blur in the softest ways. A wild bobcat teaches survival. A domestic cat teaches tenderness. And a human, carrying his own wounds, learning from both worlds that love and loyalty take many forms, and all of them matter. One chilly morning, Emma showed Elias camera footage captured overnight. It revealed Sable teaching her kittens how to stalk shadows, while Copper pretended to fall dramatically to the side, allowing the smallest kitten to win. Elias laughed, a quiet sound he hadn't heard from himself in a long while. That video captured more than behavior. It captured kindness, connection, and a kind of interwoven family no one could have planned. Stay close to this story, because as the kittens grew stronger and the days grew warmer, instinct began whispering to Sable that it was nearly time to return to the wild. What came next would test all their hearts in ways none of them were ready for. And so, when spring finally brushed its warm breath across the desert, Sable began to prepare her young for the world beyond the shed, setting the stage for a farewell both beautiful and unbearably tender. There comes a time in every story between humans and the wild when love asks for something difficult. Not protection, not comfort, but release. And for Elias, that moment arrived slowly, like the desert thawing after a long winter. Quiet, patient, and impossible to ignore. It began with a restlessness he couldn't quite name. A way Sable paused at the shed doorway each morning, her ears turning toward sounds only she understood. Her body no longer folded into sleep easily. Her eyes stayed alert, searching the horizon. It was instinct speaking, a whisper reminding her of the life she was meant to return to. The kittens were nearly 2 months old now, strong enough to tumble across the shed in a clumsy play chase, bold enough to pounce on Copper's tail with unwavering confidence. Their spots still shimmered with the soft markings of youth, but their legs, their balance, their sharp focus, those belonged to the wild already. Elias stood in the doorway one dawn, arms crossed loosely, watching them explore. He felt the familiar warmth of pride and ache blending in his chest. The feeling surprised him every morning. New life still had a way of catching him unprepared. Sable watched her young carefully, guiding them with small gestures. An ear tilted, a soft growl, a tap of her paw. She taught them to stay close, to crouch low, to read the wind. Her instincts were sharpening again, pulling her toward open land and hidden places where bobcats raised their young. It was a shift Elias had expected, but expecting something doesn't soften it. He noticed how she hesitated before eating the food he set out, how she paced the length of the shed at night, how she lifted her head at distant sounds, branches cracking, birds scolding from the juniper trees, the soft pad of something moving through the brush. Copper stayed close to her, but even he sensed the change. He no longer curled beside her as often. Instead, he sat near the doorway, as if guarding both the inside and the outside, ready for the moment when the family he had helped raise would no longer need his careful watch. One evening,
Emma visited again, her footsteps soft as she approached the shed. She carried notes and printouts, but when she stepped inside, she didn't use them. She simply watched. "They're ready," she said softly. Elias nodded. "I know." Emma glanced at him, understanding what he didn't say. Letting go feels different when you've spent years believing nothing new would ever come into your life again. Different when those small, warm bodies had slept only feet from your hands. Different when the quiet bond you formed had been the first comfort in a long, lonely stretch of years. "You've given them the best start they could have," Emma added. "Sable knows it. She's waiting for you to make it easier." The words hung between them. Kind, gentle, but true. After Emma left, Elias sat just outside the shed, listening to the night sounds. The desert had its own song, wind brushing against creosote, distant coyotes calling to one another, the rustle of small creatures beginning their nightly wanderings. He closed his eyes and let the world surround him. He thought of Margaret, of her belief that every living thing carried a story, and that sometimes the greatest kindness we can offer is allowing that story to continue without holding it back. She used to say that love isn't measured by how tightly we cling, but by how gently we release. He whispered, barely audible, "I hear you, Maggie." The next morning, Sable made her first attempt. She nudged her kittens toward the shed's open doorway. They hesitated, blinking at the bright sunlight. Copper stood beside Elias, watching with serious eyes. One kitten crept forward, touching the edge of the threshold with a cautious paw. Another backed up into Sable's front legs. The smallest simply sat and stared at the open yard, unsure whether to move. Sable didn't force them. She didn't hurry. She stepped outside first and looked back, her golden eyes meeting Elias's. In that look, he sensed something he struggled to name. Gratitude? Farewell? And something older than both. A recognition that their paths had crossed for a reason neither of them could fully understand. The kittens followed eventually, climbing over the doorway's edge one wobbly step at a time. They explored the yard beneath the warm light, their movements a mix of bold curiosity and trembling uncertainty. Elias watched from the shed, hands resting on the doorframe. Copper pressed against his leg, sharing the moment. Sable led the kittens only as far as the first cluster of juniper trees. She stayed there for several minutes, letting them smell the wild earth. Then she brought them back. A practice run, nothing more. Over the next few days, she repeated this pattern. Short trips, careful lessons, a gradual introduction to the world waiting beyond the safety of the shed. Each time they returned, Copper greeted them with a soft purr, inspecting each kitten as though checking attendance. Each time they left, Elias felt something tug deep inside, a mixture of pride and ache, love and letting go. One afternoon, the boldest kitten wandered a few feet too far. Sable corrected him instantly, guiding him back with a firm paw and a low growl. The kitten obeyed, pressing himself against her until his fear faded. Elias watched in quiet awe. She was teaching him what the world would demand: caution, awareness, instinctive boundaries. Copper added his own lesson, approaching the kitten afterward and giving a gentle nudge, as if to say, "It's all right to explore. Just don't forget where home is." Two teachers, one wild, one domestic, one human watching them both, learning something himself. It struck Elias that healing doesn't always happen through holding on. Sometimes it happens through watching something you've cared for step bravely into its own life. Sometimes the act of letting go is where the heart remembers how to open again. He found himself standing a little taller, breathing a little deeper. The ache of grief remained, but it felt lighter now, touched by the presence of 4 wild kittens who trusted him for a short season, and a mother who chose his shed as the safest place in a vast landscape. People often imagine the wild as a place far from home, but in truth, the wild arrives in moments like these, when instinct and kindness meet, when the lines between species blur, when letting go feels like an act of love. The wild teaches us that every bond has its season, and every season has its purpose. Stay with this journey, a little longer. Because even though Sable and her young were preparing to return to the life written in their bones, what came next offered something unexpected. A return that carried both closure and quiet joy. And so, as another sunrise brushed gold across the juniper branches, Elias opened the gate one final time. But the story didn't end there. What followed revealed that every connection, no matter how brief, can leave a lasting mark on a life. Some partings arrive with noise, but others come on quiet feet, leaving behind a kind of stillness that asks you to listen closer. After Sable and her young slipped into the early morning shadows, the cabin felt different. Not empty, not abandoned, but rearranged somehow, as if their presence had brushed the air into a gentler shape. For days afterward, Elias kept catching himself listening, not for footsteps or cries, but for something else, a sense, a feeling. The soft echo of 4 tiny heartbeats and a wild mother who had trusted him more deeply than he ever expected. The shed stood open now, sunlight slanting through the boards, stirring bits of loose straw left from the nest Sable had carefully shaped. Copper would wander inside sometimes, sitting in the space, his gaze drifting to the doorway, as though waiting for familiar faces to reappear. His tail flicked slowly, not agitated, but remembering. Elias swept out the shed one quiet afternoon, his movements unhurried. He wasn't cleaning to erase anything. He was honoring the days that had unfolded there. He straightened the blankets, folded the towels, and set aside the worn tools that had been sitting untouched since Margaret's time. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the heaviness he once felt stepping through that doorway. The shed had become a haven again, not only for Sable and her young, but for him. As he worked, the desert around him hummed with early spring life. Gambel's quail rustled in the brush. A warm breeze carried the scent of creosote and new growth. The world had begun moving forward again. Inside, Elias felt something shift, a softening, a letting in. The ache he carried didn't disappear, but it loosened around the edges. He had spent so long believing his heart was something fragile he needed to protect. But now, with the memory of those small wild kittens tucked inside him, he realized his heart had become something sturdier. Not unbreakable, but resilient. He began journaling again. Not the brief, factual entries he used to jot down, but full pages describing small moments. Copper sunning himself by the window, the sound of the creek thawing, the first bloom on Margaret's old prickly pear. He wrote about Sable too, her strength, her grace, her instinctive love for her young. He wrote about the way Copper had stepped into the role of unlikely teacher, and he wrote about the way caring for them had brought him back to life, inch by inch. A week after Sable left, Elias found a small tuft of bobcat fur snagged on a branch near the edge of the property. It wasn't much, just a few soft strands caught in the bark, but it brought him to a halt. He touched it gently, feeling the warmth of recognition. The fur was new, not from the time she had arrived injured, but from a creature passing back through territory that had once given her shelter. Whether she had walked that path alone or with her young, he couldn't know. But the fact that she passed close enough to leave a trace behind felt like a quiet message. A thank you, maybe? Or simply a reminder that their connection hadn't vanished when she stepped into the wild. Copper found the fur too, sniffing it intensely before brushing his cheek against Elias's boot. The gesture was soft, affectionate, almost contemplative. As days stretched into weeks, spring warmed the land. The desert blossomed in its own understated way, flowers blooming low to the ground, color hidden until you looked closely. Elias found himself doing the same thing, noticing small things he once rushed past. The way light hits the hills at dusk, the call of owls echoes through the canyon, the simple comfort of having Copper curled at his side as he read in the evenings. Then, one late afternoon, something remarkable happened. The sun had dipped low, casting long amber shadows across the yard. Elias sat on the porch, Copper resting in his lap. The breeze was warm, carrying the scent of dust and spring blossoms. It was the kind of day that made the world feel wide and open. A soft movement caught his attention near the tree line. Elias leaned forward slightly, heart tightening, not with fear, but with recognition. Sable stepped into view.
Not boldly, not cautiously, just naturally, as though the land carried her forward with ease.
Behind her, 3 young bobcats followed, larger now, confident, their sleek bodies moving in quiet harmony with the evening light. Elias didn't stand. He didn't speak.
He didn't want to disturb whatever grace brought them back.
Copper sat up straighter in his lap, tail flicking once in recognition. But he too stayed silent.
Sable held his gaze across the yard,
a calm, steady moment filled with all the emotion words could never hold. She didn't approach. She didn't linger, but she offered something unmistakable. Acknowledgement, memory, connection. Then she turned, guiding her young back into the desert's soft hush. The moment lasted only a breath, but it left a warmth in him that stayed long after she disappeared. Letting go, he realized, doesn't mean losing.
Sometimes it means making space for the wild to return in its own way, when it chooses, when it's ready, when the bond between 2 lives hasn't ended, only changed shape.
He thought of Margaret then, not with the weight of grief, but with gratitude.
She had taught him to open the door, to listen with the heart first, to see the beauty and kindness even when it arrives unexpectedly.
Sable had reminded him of those truths. Copper had shown him that love can come from the most unlikely companion. And the kittens, those little sparks of wild hope, had taught him that healing comes gently, often through caring for someone who needs you, even if only for a short while. We often think the wild exists far from our lives, tucked away in forests or mountains or deserts. But sometimes the wild steps right up to our doorstep, asking only for a little kindness and reminding us of something essential, that love, loyalty, and gentleness exist in every corner of this world, waiting for us to notice. And in noticing, we begin to heal.
Before you go, take a quiet moment and ask yourself, who or what has crossed your path and changed you in ways you didn't expect? If this story touched your heart,
if it reminded you of the goodness still alive in the world, I invite you to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps stories like this continue to find the people who need them most.
And if you feel called to go a little further, you can leave a warm super thanks or a small donation.
Every bit helps us rescue, rehabilitate, and protect wild animals like bobcats, creatures who deserve safety, kindness, and a chance to live out their own beautiful stories in the world they call home.